Oops, I can't. We have 21 sign-ons. So everybody, my name is Cindy Buxton. I'm sort of the curator of the Armchair Traveler series, which is a series run through the library in the wintertime of travel stories and adventure stories from people in Haines and our region that want to share their trips with us. And many of I called it the Armchair Traveler series because I imagine we'd all be sitting down in our armchairs. This is in the year after the pandemic, and we could go on travels without having to go do all the miserable stuff, and maybe inspire us to go do some of the great things that other people have done. So tonight we're doing a talk by Brian Weed. It's called Packrafting the Stikine, the border to Wrangell, 45 miles of river, hot springs, and Garnets. Next week, we're going to do a talk by George Figdor, who's given a couple of these talks as well in the past. And this one is Traveling the Big World with Little Children. He traveled a lot when his children were small, and so he's going to tell us some of those stories. And then that will be the last talk for this year. Next year, I think I now have 5 or 6 talks lined up. We'll probably run them from January through April next winter. So if you want to do a talk, get hold of me. We can help you scan your slides or pictures and help you do the technical stuff of getting into PowerPoint. And it does take some of your time, but you end up with a nice finished product. You get your slides all organized and scanned, and you have a recording that you can share with your grandkids or other family members or whatever at some point. So I will introduce, before I introduce Brian, those of you who haven't joined us before, Matt Gilson is the deputy director of the library, and he's running this through the library. And he'll run all the Zoomy parts. And if you have questions during the talk, you can type them into the chat window, and they might show up. Brian might be able to see them, but probably the questions will get answered at the end of the talk. And also at the end of the talk, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask a question verbally if you don't want to type it in. So that's how that will work. And then Matt is also making a recording, and it'll be available on the library webpage. I think it's called the e-programs. Anyway, Brian might tell us, Matt might tell us where it is, but it'll be there probably tomorrow, and you can watch it or send the link to friends that you also should see the talk. So Brian was born and raised in Juneau. He does lots of exploring in the region. He founded and runs the Juneau's Hidden History, which is a group that explores the region and finds all sorts of really cool places and things. They run several multi-day trips every year and a number of smaller things. And he runs a website and all sorts of really cool things. So here's Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'll kind of get right down to it. I always try to plan trips that the average outdoorsy person can do. We're not climbing, Mount St. Helens. We're not, going to the Himalayas. We're not going to South America. We're exploring our own backyards here in Southeast Alaska. I always try to have my trips be not on the crazy side. In this case, it was 45 miles. The river below the border is all class 1, class 2, so there's nothing really scary as far as rapids go. And there's cabins all along the way. I'm going to bring up the map. When I go to do the slideshow, I'll have a link to the map. If you're looking on our Facebook group, Juneau's Hidden History, I did provide a link to the map there if you want to bring it up. I always create a map when I plan one of these group adventures. And we're looking at our Google map here, and Wrangell is right down here. I made a huge mouse pointer so everybody can see. And we're leaving Wrangell. We fly into Wrangell with Alaska Airlines. There's not great flights going in and out of Wrangell, out of Juneau, so we kind of land in the late afternoon. There is a tour company that can take you upstream for about $800. It comes to about $100 a person. They'll take you up to the Mount Flemmer cabin, which is right on the U.S. and Canadian border up here. They'll zip us upriver, drop us off right at the cabin, and then it's just 4 or 5 days of rafting down the lower Stikine, exploring along the way, and stopping at cabins. So the map's there for everybody to see. If you click on the different lines, it'll show photos of what that looked like during the travel or what the cabin looks like. So a very interactive map for you to look at. It's better on a computer than on your cell phone, but that's what I have and kind of gives you an idea of the trip. I'm going to switch over to the slideshow, but I want you to know that that map's there in case you get lost along the way. So we got our slideshow. It was the first time bringing my tiny dog with me on adventures. He was, I want to say he was close to 8 months old. His name's Doug, and he was going to come on this trip, and it was going to be his first big trip. So I gathered together 5 of my friends that had done pack rafting before. I knew I could trust them on the river, and I knew I could trust them on a long distance multi-day activity. So we set up, we flew into Wrangell. Some important links here. There's the map. When you fly into Wrangell, you can't bring your stove fuel. You also can't bring your bear spray. So things you're going to need to buy in Wrangell when you land, you're going to buy stove fuel and bear spray. They have a couple sporting goods stores that you can go to buy those. The airport is about a mile from town, so you do have to walk into town or get a taxi. Cabins along the way, we use the Flemmer cabin near the Canadian-US border, the Shake Slough cabin. There's 2 cabins there that are 200 feet apart on the river. I suggest renting both cabins. That way you know who your neighbors are. We thought about it, and it was like, it'd be really weird to have somebody really loud and obnoxious in the cabin next to us. We didn't want that. Then we have the Mount Rynda cabin. Hopefully somebody tells me how to pronounce that a little better. Rynda cabin, probably the best on the Stikine, like perfect location with a clear creek in front of it, the Milky River kind of right nearby. We could see seals like catching fish right out in front of the cabin. Just amazing spot. And then the Garnet Ledge cabin near the world famous Garnet Mountain. There are another couple of cabins that we didn't use, the Twin Lakes, and a couple that are sitting on an island just right at the mouth of the Stikine. The company that I recommend you taking is Breakaway Adventures. Their contact information's here. For 8 people, 50 pounds each. You're looking at $800-ish to the Mount Flemmer cabin, and they can pick you up on the main docks in Wrangell. So here is us leaving Wrangell and heading up the Stikine. We went with a couple of buddies that had river boats. The first time going up it, I had never been up the Stikine before, so I wanted to make sure I knew what I was getting into. We had planned the route down some of the back sloughs, and I convinced my 2 buddies to take us up the back sloughs so we could pre-check the route before we came downriver, looking for logs or sweepers or anything that might be in the way if we needed to change the route. I don't believe there's any audio for this, but just kind of get you an idea what we were looking at our very first day, you know, partly cloudy skies, the 2 jet boats zipping us upriver. We had all our gear down on the floor of the boat. Our buddy Scott stopped and showed us some really neat things along the way, like this waterfall. There's houseboats along the way on the river. People can't build on the shore, so they build floating boats. That cabin was actually pretty great. It had heat. It had a bathroom. Good grief, there was everything in that thing. I think it was even 2 beds, one on the main floor and one up top. As you go upriver, just fantastic. Clear views, not a lot of sweepers. We didn't see hardly any trees. The river's flowing between like 3 and up to like 8 miles an hour. It's pretty fast flowing, but it's wide and flat, so we didn't have a lot of rapids. We found out there's a thing called taking your water. When you have 2 jet boats in front of each other, one in front of the other, and they're exactly in front of each other, and you're traveling through about 4 inches of water, the boat in front of you will actually take the water away, and so all of a sudden there's a dry sandbar in front of the second boat, which causes you to skid to a stop like we did. Luckily, nobody was ejected out of the boat. You kind of just slowly like skim to a stop and get stuck. So there, Greg is standing in ankle deep water as we had to pick up the boat and negotiate it off of the sandbar. Kind of weird standing out in the middle of the river with like half a mile on each side, and you're only standing in 4 inches of water. The boats took us up to the Canadian border. They dropped us off at the Flemmer cabin. We left our gear and we went up to the border, and there's a spot where there's a clear cut of about 30 feet. You can see it traveling up the mountain here in this shot. And then there's monuments that are between the United States and the Canadian border all over Alaska. I think this was Monument 62. You give me a second here, I'll look. This was Monument 63. So tons of monuments all around the US-Canadian border. There's a clear cut, and then there's this tower, the monument, that's actually there. And it says Canada on one side and United States on the other, so you can play that game on which side am I on kind of thing. But we stopped there and got to check that out. There's a out-of-print book that talks about the guys who originally surveyed Alaska and the travel and hardship they did as they put these monuments and survey points in. First cabin we stopped at was the Mount Flemmer cabin. Mount Flemmer cabin is tucked in on the side of a really steep slope. There's a small creek nearby to get water. Uses kerosene heat or diesel number 1. We found that on our trip we didn't haul fuel. We went in June. It was warm enough, even on rainy days. We found enough fuel in the stoves that we were able to heat up and dry everything off. In front of the Flemmer cabin is this great beach, but after looking at it for a while, we realized we were rafting the Stikine at pretty low water time, so this beach might not actually exist during high water. Little Doug loved running around on the sand dunes and spinning circles all around us. The Flemmer cabin in this shot is located just out of view. I believe it's right behind this guy over here. I think you can see my mouse pointers. No, apparently you can't see my mouse pointers. It's behind the guy in the red life jacket, is where the Flemmer cabin is. But right across from it is this big sandbar. And we were able to travel upstream and explore a little bit. In some of the back sloughs, the Stikine runs slow enough that you can go upstream quite a ways. There were certain areas where it was nice and sunny and warm, shallow water. Definitely a good place to take a bath on that first day, like starting the trip. We spent 2 nights at the Flemmer cabin just in case our boat guys decided the first day was too rough. So it gave us a 2-day window to arrive at the Flemmer cabin. This is on the sandbar across from Flemmer, looking northeast up into Canada. Nice weather the first day. We had a little bit of rain. We had 6 people. We crammed 6 people into these cabins. You could probably fit 8. Somebody sleeping on the floor for sure. And having a small dog was definitely interesting because he kept jumping around on people in the middle of the night and visiting them. Luckily, everybody was pretty happy to have a little companion along. When I chose people for this group, I wanted to have people that had high-end gear and people that had low-tech gear so we could see, kind of how it worked together. And our friend Matt here has pretty low-tech. He has one of the smallest Copapelli boats. His bedroll is a heavy mat. He had bungee cords holding everything together, and he was able to make it on the trip just fine. On the windy days, he had a little more trouble, got a little more water in his boat. I would recommend a pack raft with a spray skirt, but you know, he was able to get to each spot wet, but arrived. We're leaving the Flemmer cabin, doing some exploring as we headed downriver. You can see Matt on the right. His boat is just a tad too small, so he's got his feet hanging out. I always recommend that you get a pack raft about 2 sizes bigger than what they recommend on the website. The pack raft size that they're giving you is for whitewater rafting. So if you're going to do any kind of long distance travel like this, I recommend having a longer pack raft so you can stretch out your feet. On the river, you're traveling anywhere from like 3 miles an hour to 8 miles an hour, depending on how skinny it is. So often we'd just stop paddling and you'd kind of just drift. You never knew how deep the water is. It could be 8 feet here, or it could be 4 inches. So here we're seeing a baby moose. We never saw the mom, but she could have been nearby. Things like that are kind of spooky because you don't know how deep the water is. So if all of a sudden mama moose wanders into the water, she could actually chase after you because you might not be in that deep of water. Stopped for breaks on the first day. We were heading for the hot springs. Lots of spots to pull over and pull out. You can see the water's pretty moving fast behind them. Made for some quick days to different cabins. This is coming up the Shake Slough to the hot springs. There's a good sized hot springs about halfway through the trip. And this is Shake's Hot Springs. It's indoor hot springs. They have it all sealed up. There's bug netting all the way around it and a pool inside. And then there's another hot spring cedar tub that they have out on this deck that we're looking at here. And we camped in front of the deck, which the reason why I like to do an exploratory trip and then actually do the real thing with inexperienced people is this very reason. We camped in front of this deck, not knowing that most of the time where we were camping at high water is underwater. So we learned for next time, don't camp at the hot springs. There weren't really any flat places nearby to actually pitch a tent. So it makes a good lunch stop and then continue on towards your next day. You're showing the inside of the indoor springs. They have pipes running down the hill that feed the tubs. And we were not alone on this trip. While we were at the hot springs, there was at least 2 or 3 other groups that arrived. We thought maybe tourists, but we found out 2 were locals, and the other one was like U.S. Fish and Game. They were doing a study down on the sand dunes that are further downriver, and so they come up here in the afternoon to soak in the tubs before going to bed for the night. There's Doug and Greg and Juan chilling in the hot tub. Water, I want to say, was around 105. If you were in it for a short period of time, not a big deal. I stayed too long and just about cooked myself in there. But definitely nice to relax your shoulders after a long paddle. This is the outdoor tub. So we left the hot springs, headed down Shake Slough, and hit the main river again. The river is going pretty quick where the slough and the river meet up. And we skipped down about 3.5 miles and got to the Shake's cabins. Now there's 2 cabins here. There's one shown in the photo, and then the other one is just out of the photo to the right. They're so close together, I recommend just renting both of them. That way you have a little extra space on that day. This was the buggiest place on our trip. We were wearing head nets most of the time we were here. We tried making a fire. Fire scared some of the bugs away, but there's a swamp just to the north, and we found the wind coming off Shakes Glacier wasn't enough to keep the bugs away at this location. Doug always tried to get a few more calories out of each person on the trip. He'd sit on top of you and try to get food, which was nice because he picked up all the scraps, so we didn't have to worry about bears or anything. That's the view from the Sheikh's cabin. Up in, I guess, about where the sun is setting is where the Sheikh's Glacier is. It's up in one of those valleys. It's about 5 or 6 miles up there. A couple of our group paddled upriver. We're able to see towards it, but weren't able to get to it in the time frame that we had. We're hoping to hit that in this 2024 trip. Greg's sporting the bug net. As we moved downriver, we always had to be careful because in some spots the river's over a mile across. So you always wanted to make sure you were on the correct side of the river to hit the slough you wanted, because to backtrack would be near impossible. I know it looks really slow, but the water's moving you pretty good most of the time, and to backpedal for any length or distance would be hard. Some amazing waterfalls on the trip. This one in particular, there's a big lake up on the hill, and at high water, you'll get two waterfalls here that both the zigzag look like water slides coming down that rock. Always checking our GPS devices, making sure we were going the direction we wanted to go and finding the slough we needed. This was one of the back sloughs on our way to the Mount Rida cabin. This cabin was pretty sweet. Not only did we have firewood, there's a little fire pit outside. There was fuel in the stove. It has this big creek access to the east that takes you back into this big valley. And we were able to sit on the beach and watch seals catch fish right out in front of the cabin. There's a milky water layer that meets a clear layer of the Clearwater Creek, and the seals just run back and forth on this line of milky water and pop out every time they see a fish and grab it. That way, when they're in the milky water, they're invisible to the fish. Going up one of these little side creeks. We paddled up quite a ways. Now, I think most of these side creeks that you'll see on the map next to each cabin, you probably paddle up 5 or 6 miles, so you could add another, 5 to 6 miles to your 10-mile day, paddling from cabin to cabin, and then having something to do in the afternoon. The views were spectacular. The water was clear. If you were into fly fishing, we saw lots of fish and trout. I don't think the salmon had quite started to run, but there was some sort of fish running beneath us in schools. Kind of in the background, you can see the milky white layer where it meets the Clearwater Creek. The seals would play right on that line in the background. As we left the Mount Rida cabin, we started getting into some rain. Of course, I had to keep Doug dry. Little tiny guy gets cold quick. So a lot of rain gear on the trip. People started with their raincoats out, rain pants, that kind of thing. This was the day probably Matt got the wettest just due to not having a spray skirt on his boat. So over time, the rain pools off your gear and starts filling your boat up with water. We got Adam and Carly here. Carly was, I think she was tired by then. I know Adam was. They had gone up towards the Shakes Glacier the night before, so it was a long day for them. But you can see the water's flat. We had no trees in the way, nothing really to worry about. Now, we did talk about, while there is no trees in the water is moving quickly. It's 35-ish degree water. So if you were to get a hole in your pack raft, that's kind of the big emergency, is you'd immediately want to paddle to shore or load somebody into another boat, load gear. So we always talked about that as we paddled along, like what to look out for in an emergency, because it is possible that there could be a stump under the water and you can skewer your boat on one of the branches sticking off that stump, which is a real concern. It doesn't seem like you could, but when you're traveling 7, 8 miles an hour and all of a sudden you come to a stop, stabbed on a branch, your boat's going to deflate pretty quickly. So it was something we talked about, something we didn't exactly practice, but we talked about how we'd have to move the bag to another boat, and somebody with the bigger boat would have to pick up the person. For a pack rafting patch kit, we brought Tyvek tape. Works better than duct tape. Tyvek, once you stick it to something, it's pretty much stuck there. So if you ever got a hole in your boat, you could patch it pretty instantly with some Tyvek tape. We came down river. We got to this is the Garnet Ledge cabin. It's at the base of Garnet Mountain. Nearby is the world famous Garnet Ledge. It's owned by the First Presbyterian Church out of Wrangell. A lot of people are like, oh, you can't dig garnets. You can't dig garnets. Well, you can dig garnets. You just can't dig garnets on their claim. You have to be off their claim. I had scouted this on another trip where I found the upper markers of their claim up on the mountain. And so I was able to hike up with my buddies and get some garnets on this trip, but we made sure we were off the private property, which several members of the town of Wrangell were very adamant that make sure we were off the private property. Plenty of garnets out there. In fact, the garnets that I brought back, I showed to some people in Wrangell. They said they hadn't seen garnets that big in a long time. So it is possible for the general public to dig garnets, but you're going to go, I don't know, a mile up the mountain. You're going to go up Garnet Creek and just kind of work your way up. And on each side of Garnet Creek, there are some postings for the private property boundaries, and you can work your way around it. Something we experienced while we were on the trip was Doug wanted to play with this toad, and this is the western toad, also known as a borealis toad. They are poisonous. So little Doug decided to take a bite of one. His mouth instantly filled with foam, and he started aspirating. I had seen similar before, but didn't realize what was going on at first. We were able to rinse his mouth out, flush him real good, kind of waterboard the puppy kind of thing. And turns out Western toads are pretty deadly to small dogs and cats, that kind of thing. They have little poison pouches in their little bumps, and when you bite them, those poison pouches pop, and dogs can get sick. About an hour later, Doug was feeling better, but for about an hour, he was seeing stars and vomiting and, you know, holding together. But I was a wreck. I was so upset. But now he doesn't mess with toads, so it's not a big deal anymore. He's learned his lesson and hopefully survived from it. The Garnet Ledge, I can't stress how awesome the garnets are from up there. You can find them the size of a quarter. You can find garnets the size of a golf ball. That's how they look in the rock. This isn't cut stones. That's exactly how it looks when you flake them off the schist. In every museum I've ever been to, there are garnets from Garnet Mountain in their museum. If they have any kind of rock collection, look right for the garnets, and for some reason it always has the Stikine garnets. So these garnets have traveled all over the world. Our last day looking out at from the Garnet Ledge, great sunset, great views. Now it's a 2-mile paddle back to Wrangell from the Garnet Ledge. Well, it's longer than 2 miles, but it's a 2-mile open stretch of water from shore to shore. It's shown on the map. We chose to get a ride from our buddies, but two of our people in the group decided to paddle it and see how it was. Wasn't bad, but there are some currents right near the Wrangell shore when the tide changes. There's some whirlpools, fast-moving water right along the shoreline, so something to look out for if you're going to paddle all the way back to Wrangell. Of course, Doug didn't want to go. Everybody was packing up their stuff, and he just kind of wanted to sleep after his whole toad incident. This is us zipping back. Pretty short work for the river boats. I think it took about 2-hour paddle for our other guys to paddle back to Wrangell. They went on an outgoing tide, so they were pulled out. They just warned us that right near the shore there was some ripples and tide pools and whirlpools going on. Of course, in Wrangell, you got to stop and look at the Wrangell Petroglyph Beach. Quarter mile from the airport, there's a beach with over 50 petroglyphs. They're right in front of people's houses. There's a deck down to it, easy access. There's signs where they are, and members of the public keep a good eye on them. So we were able to walk around and look at all the different petroglyphs that were around the area. Just north of the petroglyph beach is an old dump site. It was used for a really long time. I think they call it the sanitary landfill. But it's a combination of broken bottles and old shoes and just anything you can think of that probably didn't decompose. And it's just to the north of Petroglyph Beach. Tons of glass bottles, tons of just weird things from 100 years ago. Soup bones, old ships, a lot of rusty stuff. Definitely a neat beach to check out if you're in Wrangell. Check out the petroglyphs and then just walk a little bit north. Shakes, Chief Shakes was based out of Wrangell. He had his house on a little island that's in the center of Wrangell, and there's a totem park, also something to look at while you're in Wrangell. And that's kind of the end of my slideshow because I wanted to go through questions. I usually go long on these things. My map pretty much explains everywhere we went. It has distance and mileage. So if we zoom in here on the map, when we came upstream, we can see it was 40.6 miles that we went up in the river boats from Wrangell to get to the Mount Flemmer cabin with a little kind of loop-de-loop tour that our guys showed us around on. And then each stage of the trip, you're able to click on and see how many miles it is. So you get an idea of how far we paddled each day. I have separate boxes on the map for like explore here in 2024. We have a picture of Greg laying on his pack raft, but that's the direction of travel to go up into that river valley. And that's kind of my goal for 2024 is to come up here into this river valley and explore it a little more. And each spot kind of has a thing like that on the map to explore for this next year. I'm open for questions. I'd be happy to talk about the trip and anything that anybody has questions on. I need to open the chat though, because I can't see that. Anybody know how to get to the chat part? Nope, there it is. I can see the pointer. How hard is it to book the cabins? Are they in high demand? I book them out almost 6 months in advance just because I wanted to make sure I had each cabin along the way. It would suck to book the first one and not get the second one or the third one or the fourth one. And you're kind of booking them in reverse because you're grabbing the Flemmer cabin, Mount Flemmer first, and then you're kind of working your way back to Wrangell. Cabins were in great shape. The one that was used the hardest was probably the Garnet Ledge one. It's really easy for the locals to get there. And I think it's just more people use it in the season, so it was a little more banged up. It had a lot of Boy Scout carvings and kids' names written on the wall and some crayon and marker and that kind of stuff. But the further you were towards the border, the better, the nicer, the less vandalized the cabins were. Best time to go that far up the river? I don't know. So talking with the locals, June is kind of the low water time. You're starting to get the snow melt up in the mountains in Canada, so the river is starting to rise in June. The first time we went, it was in the first week of June. This time we're going in the last week of June. So I'm trying to get a feel of what the river feels like with maybe a little more water this time. I didn't protect Doug from the bugs. I had bug spray that was DEET free. You don't want to use DEET around pack rafts. DEET will actually eat the rubber of a pack raft. So any bug spray I put on him was like an all natural, like a mint or some other oil, essential oil kind of thing that supposedly kept bugs away, which didn't. When using Tyvek repairs, does the boat need to be perfectly dry? Yeah, but if you have a towel or a shirt, perfectly dry on a rubber surface is dry really quick. Putting Tyvek tape on in the rain probably wouldn't be a good idea, but like if I got a hole, I'd paddle to shore, pull the boat up, 10 minutes, wiping it down. If it was a rainy day, maybe we'd put a raincoat over it just so it could dry in time. And then Tyvek tape, man, I'd even use it for first aid. It holds things for a long time and really strong. Did I see many people on the river? We saw a couple of boats. There were some river tour boats that came up while we were paddling down. Some people were paying attention to the river and some people were not. So we had to make sure we didn't get run over at any time. A lot of times the person running the boat would be chatting with their people on board and they weren't looking for small boats 4 inches off the water. So you were always kind of grouped together when you saw another boat coming upriver, especially in the skinny spots, because you wanted them to see us. Luckily, most pack rafts are super bright colored, so they draw attention. One of us did have an air horn, which we could have honked, but we never had to. Most of us had bear spray, and I don't think anyone brought a firearm on the trip, just due to the issues bringing it through Alaska Airlines. It just seemed too complicated, and we're on the water most of the time, so we decided bear spray would be good enough.
I have a question. So because you can't really go backward upriver when you're in the pack rafts very well, and you had like 4 or 5 boats, I imagine sometimes it's like herding cats, but you probably want people to kind of keep together so that if somebody does have an emergency, do you have any, did that work well, keeping everybody together?
For the most part, yeah, we stayed together. A couple of the more advanced paddlers split off and looked at one side of the river while the rest of us traveled on the other side of the river, but we kept everybody in sight. I asked people on the trip, obviously I'm not in charge. I do a lot of the planning, but I'm like, "Hey, you're on your own here. We're friends traveling together. I'll help you, you help me if there's a problem." But before like somebody would paddle off, I'd be like, "Hey, you need to keep us in sight. We got another 2 miles before we have to hit that slough." And I trusted the people that went off separately on those paddles downstream, but they always stayed within sight. Uh, but one guy came pretty close. Like he paddled on the far side, and it was probably a mile and a half across, and he made it back to our side just in time to hit the slough. Where if he'd have waited any longer, he'd have been hiking up through alders trying to get back to the slough, which I don't recommend splitting the group. Once you get to the cabin and you're at base camp kind of thing, then a lot of us split up because none of us were going to go down river. Some people just wanted to rest in the cabin and sit around a fire and listen to their audiobook. Other people like me were like, "Hey, let's add another 10 miles to the trip and let's go up this valley over here." Um, but everybody had an in reach for the most part. Everybody could communicate with each other. If we were running late, we're like, "Hey, we're 7 miles up the creek, on our way back," and fired off to the in reaches. Everybody then knew and kind of passed the message on to each other. Would a self-bailing pack raft be sensible on this trip? No. Self-bailing pack rafts have holes in the bottom, so you're constantly sitting in 2 to 3 inches of water. While you're more stable on the river, you're sitting in cold water the whole time. Self-bailing pack rafts are really only good for really strong whitewater where you need to stay balanced in your boat. I don't recommend pack rafts that have the T-zip either, that opens the pack raft so you can stuff things inside. Southeast Alaska most of our rivers are glacial. They have silt in them, and once that silt gets in that zipper, I've totally seen people not be able to close their zipper. I've seen people like leaking air across a lake when we did the Cross Admiralty trip where somebody got sand in their zipper and she's halfway across the lake and all of a sudden the thing's deflating and we're once again playing Kama Sutra of pack rafts and somebody's leaning out of their boat trying to put air into her boat just so they can make it across the lake. So self-bailing pack rafts, not a great idea. You're sitting in water, and I recommend the spray skirt over the top and no T-zip if you're buying your first pack raft. Did I see many bears? Many bears. I want to say we saw 2, but they were all far away on shore. Nothing was right next to us in the river except for that young moose calf. We looked really hard for mom. We listened for mom. Everybody was pretty nervous while the moose calf was alongside us because we didn't know how deep the river was right there. Often we'd be traveling along the river and I'd be paddling, and all of a sudden my paddle would just hit the bottom. You'd think you were in like 8 to 10 feet of water, and you were really in like 4 inches of water. With the silt in the river, you can't tell how deep it is. So to see a moose calf on the shore, mama moose could come walking out and she's only in 2 feet of water, and I bet she can run, 30, 40 miles an hour in 10 inches of water. You're not going to outrun her. Somebody asked about Telegraph. How far was this area from the Stikine Road access? I think it's called Telegraph. So a lot of people raft down the Stikine, and they usually go with a guiding company, and they launch from Telegraph. See if I can find Telegraph on my map. Jackson. It can't be that far. There it is, Telegraph Creek. So it's quite a ways up there. There are tours that are several $1,000s to actually do this with a tour guiding company. Usually with my group travels and trips, I like to plan it where we don't have a tour guide. I usually scout it first, and I try to make it easy for anybody that would want to do it. Like, this is all class 1, class 2 river. Once you cross the border, you can get into up to class 3, class 4, depending on how bad it is or how high the water is. There's several rapid sections, several places where the Stikine gets really skinny. You could travel up to 15 miles an hour on the Stikine in some spots. But below the Canadian border is all that class 1, class 2, real safe, wide, flat river. A few times you'll get into some bumpy stuff, but for the most part, you're just going to have class 1. As long as you're looking around for tree stumps, you're fine. Any other questions?
While we're waiting to see if anyone has more questions, I want to thank you, Brian. This is a huge resource for people who are planning a trip. This is great. All the information you have, in all the information on the maps and the detail and the distances, and I'm sure your information is going to get used by people wanting to do this too. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We
Now,
don't have to stop now if anyone has more questions, but I wanted to get that into. Thank you for that.
Somebody asked how many miles a day did we travel. By clicking on the map, like I can click on this line where we went from the Flemmer cabin all the way to the Hot Springs. Down here in the lower left-hand corner, it says 9.44 miles is that line. Pretty average was right around 8 miles a day. But you got to keep in mind that you're traveling an extra 2 to 4 miles an hour faster because you're traveling on the river. So paddling is not very hard. It sounds like a long day, but really it was just a couple hours between each camping spot. And then most of us added on more paddle time by paddling up the different creeks that are nearby. For this 2024 trip, we decided we would not spend the night at the Shakes Hot Springs. We're going to go from Mount Flemmer to Shakes Hot Springs, get there about noon, have lunch, sit in the hot springs a couple hours. We found that was a great length of time. And then it's about a 4-ish mile paddle to the next cabin. So on that day, we're going to do, I don't know, just shy of 14 miles with a long break for lunch. So it'll be a long day, but we get a hot springs in the middle. Are currents a problem by Wrangell, or was it tidal? Slack tide is definitely, an outgoing tide's actually probably the best for crossing. What you're looking at here is the Garnet Ledge cabin. It's right near the mouth of the Stikine. And Wrangell's down here on the point where all the waypoints are. Now, I recommend if you're going to paddle from the Garnet Ledge back to Wrangell, you hug the shoreline as much as possible, and you actually go into the inlet to the east of Wrangell before you cross. I'd go on an outgoing tide that's changing to the slack tide and cross right at the slack tide. We did find that there are some pretty big currents by the Wrangell Airport and by Grave Island. I think it's Grave Island, Dead Man's Island. So something to watch out for right along the shoreline, the whirlpools, and there was some really fast moving water. So cross at the slack tide when the water's not moving, best time to get to shore. And you can pull up right at the petroglyph beach. We found that was a great place to just pull over and go right to the beach. Anybody else? For 2025, I'm planning this trip one more time to just see the other side of the river. There's supposedly another hot springs. It's a small warm springs near a cliff that's near the Twin Lakes cabin. The Twin Lakes cabin's smaller than the other cabins on the river, but the plan is to go back and stay at that one and kind of mix and match of which cabins we use, and then paddle into these Twin Lakes and try to find this warm springs that's supposedly over here in the corner. For the 2024 trip, we have 8 people already lined up to go. We're going to fit 4 in each of the river boats, kind of go up in the same pattern, get dropped off at Flemmer, and paddle our way back. We'll just change the one cabin overnight. Won't be at the Hot Springs, it'll be at the Shakes cabin. How many total days of fuel and sundries should someone expect to pack for this? You could probably do this trip in 3 days, 2 nights because of how fast the river moves. But really, we're going to be doing it 1 night, 2 nights, 3, 4, looks like 5 nights on this 2024 trip. We're going to do it 6 days, 5 nights, I guess. And we arrived back in Juneau at like 9 p.m. on the last night. So 5 days worth of food. I always take an extra day's worth of food just in case for some reason we get stuck. Plane doesn't fly out in Wrangell and we end up sitting at the airport. The nice thing about taking a riverboat up and then paddling back to a town, you're ending at a town, so there's stores, there's supplies, there's friends there, so you can stay in somebody's garage or go to the museum for the day, that kind of thing. Do I have any other trips planned for this summer? Yes, here in May, May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, I have a planned group trip to Admiralty Cove. Admiralty Cove was where a native village site used to be. And we're going to fly in there and stay at a cabin and then have some group walks around the area and point out where old flower bed, or excuse me, garden beds used to be. There's an apple grove, canoe drag spots, and some petroglyphs in the area. Is there a good place to leave the bear fuel and spray in with? Well, we have our friends hold on to the bear spray for us, and then we usually pick up the bear spray when we come back to Wrangell, but it only lasts quite a while. I want to say bear spray lasts like 3 years, 4 years before you want to replace it, something like that. So we've left the bear spray and the fuel with our friends each time. Sometimes they still have it, sometimes they used it. So we just kind of buy it and then leave it with our friends when we go to leave Wrangell. Last time I think we left some on the trash can by the airport. I'm sure somebody picked it up and used them. One thing we really liked when we got all done with the trip, our buddy Jordan picked us up, and Jordan's wife owns a little restaurant in Wrangell called Sweet Tides. And when you've been eating Mountain House for 5 days, and you walk into that restaurant where they have like grilled ham and cheese, where the cheese is like dripping off the like homemade sourdough bread, That was just kind of ridiculous for us, where everybody spent like $40 there and loaded up on like high dense carbohydrate food. Uh, and definitely a nice treat to kind of end in Wrangell was at this the bakery called Sweet Tides while we were there. All right.
Thank
Hopefully
you,
this
Brian.
I'm hoping this map helps people plan a trip like this. It wasn't overly complicated. The back sloughs are real slow. Um, I like to plan trips like this that the average kind of backpacker and multi-day hiker paddler could do, and that's what this really is. It's not super hard and it's not super dangerous. That's all I got.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And maybe you'll give a talk for us next year too.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye,
Thank you. That
everybody.
was awesome.